Good morning, Changemakers, and welcome to the Environmental Changemaker series brought to you by Environmental Scouts. You are in for a real treat today as we hear from Xiye Bastida, Joseph Wilkanowski, and Tessie Sebastian, co-founders of Re-Earth, and three of the most inspirational young activists. I am personally really excited to meet them and talk to them. I'm Dr. Adriana Glazner, co-founder of Environmental Scouts. I'm a mom, an education consultant, and a teacher. Yesterday, I introduced you to our youngest co-founder and inspiration behind Environmental Scouts, Brooke Thorman. Brooke is a 10-year-old environmental activist, hi Brooke, and earth lover. She also happens to be one of my students. Brooke is with us again today. How you doing over there, Brooke?
I'm really doing great. And good. I'm so honored to have you all speak to us. My family and I watched the movie 2040 earlier this year. And our future, where it's headed, is actually really scary. But the movie gave me hope. What you're doing, getting young people involved, I think is really important. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Wow.
So as you can see, this very inspirational young person herself, her idea for an environmental club for kids quickly grew into an opportunity to connect individual change makers and nonprofit organizations to share their resources for an amplified impact. So our Environmental Changemaker series is our first labor of love to help achieve that goal. We want each of you to see that you are part of a coalition of partners worldwide. There are so many groups and individuals, countless, just already doing the work. There's materials out there, there's initiatives just waiting to be discovered. And we proudly bring you this series to amplify those voices and to help you find yours, regardless of what your cause might be. So please like this video and subscribe below. Subscribe below. Yeah. You can follow us on social media: Facebook at Environmental Scouts, Instagram is at Enviro Scouts LA. That's ENVIRO Scouts LA. So joining us today, I'm so excited. We have Xiye Bastida, Joseph Wilkanowski, and Tessie Sebastian, co-founders of Re-Earth Initiative. And like I said before, these amazing young activists. These are change makers out there doing the work right now. So whether you're like Brooke and you can see yourself being just like these three in 8 or 10 years, or you're like me and my generation, whom the earth desperately needed like 20 years ago, I know you'll be inspired. So you might be inspired to take up their causes or maybe to pursue your own. So I had another 3 or 4 minutes of content prepared right now to tell you all the amazing things they're doing, but I think it'll be better to just get out of the way and let their voices take over, as it should be. So without further ado, Xiye, Joseph, and
Perfect. So hi, everyone. My name is Joseph Wilkanowski, and I am one of the co-founders of Re-Earth, and then I'll let my other co-founders introduce themselves as well.
Hi, everyone. I'm Xiye Bastida.
Hi, guys. My name is...
Oh, you go ahead, Tessie. Go ahead.
So hi, my name is Teresa. I'm from Ireland, and I'm one of the co-founders of Re-Earth Initiative. And Xiye, take it away.
Yeah, and hi, everyone. I'm Xiye Bastida. I am also one of the co-founders of Re-Earth Initiative. Previously, I worked with Fridays for Future in New York City, and we're so excited to talk to you today. If we go to the next slide, we can start to tell you a little bit about what Re-Earth Initiative is and what we do.
So the first question that we had prepared was, how did Re-Earth start? And I think that really goes towards Xiye and how she really started it, because she was the one that kind of got us all together and created what Re-Earth is and the original 14 members. And I think I will let her explain like the whole story behind that.
Yeah, so Re-Earth Initiative actually started as a campaign for Earth Day because, as we all know, we couldn't strike anymore because of the global pandemic. So I thought to myself, what can we do to still engage people? What can we do to still make people feel like they have a voice, even if we can't go out and protest for climate legislation? So I decided to contact people who I knew around the world. And, you know, we ended up as 14 co-founders of just a campaign. It wasn't an organization yet. And all of us got together and asked ourselves, how can we make people be engaged? And we gave people the task through our social media to pledge to do a systemic action and an individual action to address the climate crisis. And we had a reach of 300,000 people. So we decided that it was a great team, and we decided that we wanted to stay together as an organization. We have people from Ireland and Singapore and Costa Rica and Chile and Australia and India and Mexico. So it's a really, really diverse group. And we're so excited to share our journey with you. So I'm going to let Tessie talk to you about the projects that we've been part of.
Yeah, so just talking a bit about the projects, we've been quite lucky to be able to have such a great impact on the very few months that we were established. And one of the ways we did that was through our Earth Day campaign. And I'm sure she had mentioned, it was the first thing that really launched Re-Earth Initiative. And through that, we were able to we saw that there was a gap out there for environmental activists who weren't already in this circle of climate activism. And a lot of the information that was out there was quite hard to understand or just in English. And we wanted to tackle that, which is why some of our toolkits are actually translated into multiple languages, such as Mandarin, Hindi, Persian, Italian, French, and Spanish. And that kind of was one of the main reasons why Re-Earth Initiative became Re-Earth Initiative, as we wanted to close up that gap. And talking a bit more on the webinars, we do webinars such as this one, where we talk from young people to young people, because I think that's quite impactful. And talking a bit more, I think, Joseph, do you want to talk a bit more about the fashion projects we're involved in?
Yeah, of course. So a little bit of an overview before we actually get right into like the details about it is that we do a Life Project, which is an EU project that was introduced to us when we were doing our fashion campaign. So we worked alongside Fashion for Good and Helsinki Fashion Week, which is a sustainability webinar that's hosted by a wonderful team that is all online, also due to COVID-19. So that's why it's Fashion for Good as well. And then also another huge issue that we tackled this month was the racial justice issue. She and I are both from New York City, and there was a huge issue that came arise about Black Lives Matter, and Re-Earth kind of recognized that and saw that there was a immediate connection between climate justice and racial justice. So we stopped our plans, and we really kind of made sure that we had enough focus on racial justice and Black Lives Matter, and had webinars about it, and just like racism in the United States, because you really can't focus on a single issue because they're all intertwined. So that's what we're figuring out, and the best way to navigate everything as well. And then Xiye, do you want to introduce your 2040 project and your Escazu Agreement?
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about this later in my presentation, but basically, like Brooke already mentioned, 2040 is this documentary that basically shows you what the world would look like in 2040 if all the existing climate solutions were implemented. So we can see that the world can be so different and regenerative and sustainable and interconnected and equitable if we apply all the solutions that we already have. We don't have to go and find a saving solution because we already have a lot of those. And the last one is the Escazu Agreement, which I'm also going to talk about later. And it's basically an initiative from Latin American and Caribbean activists to get the Escazu Agreement ratified, because it is an immense help for all peoples in Latin America and the Caribbean, and it's instrumental for the Paris Agreement to work. So now I'm going to let Tessie dive into her presentation, and then Joseph and I will give you some of our perspectives as well.
Perfect. So I'm going to be talking today about climate vulnerability, because sometimes when we discuss climate change, we never really get down to the actual facts about how people are going to be impacted. I think that's one of the best points we can use to fight for climate justice, because this is a crisis that's going to be affecting people and real life people and not just statistics. So as I talk about climate vulnerability, I'll also be talking about climate mitigation and climate adaptation, which are just as important and actually are so dire for us to make sure that we decrease the amount of vulnerability each of our communities have. So going on to the next slide. Perfect. So climate vulnerabilities. Now, climate vulnerability is actually mentioned a lot in the Sustainable Development Goal 13, just climate action. But what does that actually mean? So climate vulnerability means how prone is your community to being affected by climate change? in the sense that where is your community located, your exposure? Is there a specific reason why your community is going to be more affected because of how long the drought is? Because droughts are not a certain period of time. In some places, they're longer than others, and that actually increases your exposure to climate change. Then we have sensitivity. So sensitivity is more about the actual community that's being affected. How many resources does that community have? Are they ready for another crisis? Are they ready for this impact? And finally, adaptive capacity. Now, this is very, very important because that is the solution to decreasing climate vulnerability on a community. So adaptive capacity is the resources that a community has to actually decrease the exposure and sensitivity. And without the adaptive capacity, we are left in an unjust and unfair world, which we are currently in. So moving on to the next slide, exposure. So as you can see from the graphic here, we can see that exposure is really on the actual natural side of climate change. So how often does the community get affected by floods? How long are these droughts? You know, it talks a bit more about the natural side of climate change. And then moving on to sensitivity, we talk more, like I said, the community. The people in your community, are they trained in disaster management? Do they have the resources for irrigation? Do we have good infrastructure? Do we have energy alternatives? So sensitivity talks about how we equip our communities with the tools to make sure that their climate vulnerability is not at the highest, that they are more adapted towards climate change. And then moving on to adaptive capacity, like I said, it's the availability. So when we look at this slide, we can see that richer households, even though they might go through the same drought or the same floods that a poorer household goes through, because they have more resources and because they have more assets, they are less exposed and less sensitive to these droughts because of that resource. So that's where something we really have to focus on when it comes to climate change. We need to talk about resources. We need to give our communities the equipment to make sure that they are both away from climate change in the sense that we decrease the emissions, but also the work has been done. You know, climate change is happening, and unfortunately, it will continue to happen for a while. And that's why it's so important that adaptation, that we equip our communities with the skills and resources to make sure that when such droughts and when such floods happen, that they are well able to continue fighting and keep on going to the next day. So talking about resources, to the next slide, please. Climate adaptation and climate mitigation. So these two are very, very important things. So whether you're at home trying to talk to your local council or trying to see how you can make an impact on climate change, these two things are very important. So talking a bit more about climate mitigation. So climate mitigation is the actions that reduce the emissions causing climate change. It is what we as activists try to do. We try to make sure that we are not putting out more fossil fuels out there because that's not good for the environment. So an example of climate mitigation is clean energy, making sure that we are producing our energy in a clean, sustainable way, and good transportation. We need more community buses, we need more trains, we need to make sure that we are giving communities the resources to reduce the emissions for their own. Then climate adaptation. Now, climate adaptation is the actions we have to manage the already coming impacts of climate change. For example, flood protection. A lot of communities around the world, unfortunately, especially in the global south, countries that did not actually cause climate change, they are being affected by floods and droughts. So we need to make sure that we adapt and we provide these resources for communities to adapt to these. So the next time that a flood comes around, they are protected. The next time a drought comes around, they have irrigation. So that way, we actually reduce how exposed they are to climate change. To the next slide. Perfect. So sometimes when it comes to climate adaptation and climate mitigation, they have some actions that are actually both adaptation and mitigation. So one of these is education. Now, when we educate a community about climate change, we immediately resonate in their heads that emissions, fossil fuels, not good. And that actually is an act of climate mitigation itself, as you're empowering the people to recognize that the things that they thought were okay are not okay anymore. And now in concerns of adaptation, when you teach a community disaster management, when you teach a community that when a flood happens or when irrigation happens, the importance of conserving water, that allows that community to be stronger and to be more adaptive to the impacts of climate change. Another example is urban forests. Now, urban forests is one of my favorite things as it's a huge part of climate mitigation and adaptation. Urban forests are when you have patches of trees and forest land in the middle of urban cities. So you might have some near your home. I'm not from California, so I wouldn't know. But I know that here in Ireland, we actually have a few urban forests. But what actually happens is that actually mitigates climate change by taking in those bad emissions and giving us oxygen. It also adapts us to climate change because that actually happens in times of floods. The vegetation, roots in the soil, there's less, what's the word in English? Sorry, flooding and stuff like that. So it's really important that when we are out there protesting and advocating for climate justice, that we speak a lot about climate adaptation and climate mitigation. Both of these are just as necessary. We cannot have one without the other, because the reality is that the state we're coming through, climate change is happening and will continue to happen. We must not just decrease our emissions, get rid of fossil fuels. We must also equip our communities with the resources to make sure that for the actions and the impacts that are going to come, that they are going to be strong. Because with climate adaptation and climate mitigation, we drastically decrease how vulnerable that community is. With more education, with more irrigation, that community is less vulnerable to the bad impacts of drought, as they have the information to understand what is the next thing I do. They have the resources to grow food. If you take another example, let's say floods, through climate mitigation, through less emissions out there, we're actually decreasing climate change. And then we talk about climate adaptation in floods. We are protecting households from going through the destructions of floods. So that is my piece on how important it is for climate justice to be not just emissions, because sometimes we forget how important adaptation is. So if we go to the last slide. Perfect. It's so important that we not only remember climate mitigation, but remember climate adaptation. And with that, that's my talk for today. And Joseph, you want to take it away?
Yes, thank you, Tessie. So my segment of this presentation is about sustainability, especially sustainable fashion. So if you go to the next slide, next slide, one more. I think there we go. So I'm going to talk about the Life Project and sustainability within the fashion and circular fashion economy as well. So just to give a little bit of a background of sustainable fashion is a movement and a process of fostering change to fashion products and the fashion system towards greater ecological integrity and social justice. So you could talk about reusable straws as an example of that, reusing fashion as an example of that. It's just being aware of the impact that each person has when they're buying clothes or fast fashion, for example. So a lot of that comes into system thinking, how to change the fashion world into more of a sustainable one. I showed up on here a circular fashion economy of how best a fashion company could really follow the system. So you really grow from the ground. And although we talk about cotton, a lot of the times it's mixed with microfibers that a lot of people aren't aware of. That when you are washing your clothes in the dryer or in the washing machine, those microfibers end up in the water and then they end up in the environment. So a lot of the times eco-fashion really talks about that and breaks it down and becomes transparent. So the biggest thing is transparency in the fashion world, especially when it comes to eco-fashion, because a lot of times when people and companies are talking about becoming an eco brand, they don't really show everything behind the scenes. And that's what a lot of the really big like brands that are aware of sustainable fashion are trying to show. So on the next slide, I talk about greenwashing. So greenwashing is the process of conveying a false impression or providing misleading information about how a company's products are more environmentally sound. So greenwashing is considered an unsubstantiated claim to deceive customers. So a lot of times, a lot of companies try to come out with saying that they're chemical free or that they're all natural or they're eco-friendly. A lot of times it doesn't really mean that. A lot of times they take 5% of their product and actually turns it into a eco-friendly or eco-fashion product, and they don't actually come out with a fully sustainable product. And that's why a lot of times it's misleading, especially for consumers when they go shopping. So for example, a greenwashing behavior might make claims that they're all from recycled materials. I know a lot of companies talk about their recycling materials from plastic bottles, but they never show how much the plastic bottle actually makes up the shoe or makes up the exact material. So another huge issue of sustainability in the fashion industry is how much water that they use. So the thirst of fashion is what they usually call it, is that a t-shirt plus one jean takes up 20,000 liters of water. And you can say that every single jean that you walk into a store with, that's how much water that is actually taken up. So just to give a little bit of facts is that the fashion industry is the third largest use of water globally after oil and paper. So that means that around 2 billion people that are already living in water-stressed areas is really actually an important factor for them to have access to this water. But a lot of it is consumed by fashion. And we always talk about how fresh water is a very small commodity and it's starting to shrink every single year. And fashion, of course, does not use salt water and uses fresh water. So, and they don't use gray water that they already use, that they just flush it out, and that ends up in the environment as well. So all the dye that goes into jeans and clothes, as well as all of the dye that goes into just creating labels and printing stuff, all of that ends up in the environment. And there is, in some countries, there are no plans in place to actually shows transparency behind that. So they could be dumping it in a river and it just ends up in the environment. In the US, they are starting to become a little bit better of being aware of that, but all of the risk of it in the past, you could think about all of the millions of dye that they dumped in the past, and now it's just starting to become like into the conversation. So that's like the really big issue is water consumption, as well as what they do with the gray water. So usually it averages 10,000 liters to cultivate just 1 kilogram of raw cotton. So that's another place where water really falls into the fashion industry, is actually creating cotton, turning it into real cotton. You could talk about silk also uses a lot of water. So a lot of those natural fibers, even in the eco-fashion community, is water usage. So a lot of people are trying to go into thinking of how using gray water could actually become a good idea, or using cotton grown in rain-fed areas is another one. But then that also becomes an issue. And where do you find those areas? You can't really cultivate the land because you would be creating space for it, and that causes distress to the environment. So those are a lot of the questions that are going behind sustainability and how best you could really do it. But the 5 things that I really could take away from this conversation, and that what I've learned is that water usage is a really huge issue that I just talked about. Greenwashing, I think that every single person that really wants to be aware of what they are consuming or using, it's really, you have to watch out for brands, and you also have to read in between the lines. It's really hard to see the fashion industry. They're not being transparent about everything. And I think to do your research is best, and also to you buy from brands that you actually know are transparent and trustable and trustworthy. So a lot of the times that also means that they're more expensive because of the way that they use their resources. But sometimes it's better to invest into a product than to just buy into fast fashion. So on to the next slide. I'm talking about the 7 things that you could really do to not buy into fast fashion and become sustainable. So a lot of times the best things to do is, of course, buy secondhand and vintage. I'm from New York City, and a lot of times it is very easy to go to a thrift store or Depop. A lot of times it's turned into online reselling. So that's where I would suggest, if you want to buy clothes, to go to that. A lot of times if you want to get custom made stuff, it does cost more money, but as I said, but it also means that you're at least buying from a very eco-friendly, eco-fashion brand. So Green and Clean, there's a few different brands that I've worked with, and Xiye and Re-Earth has worked with, that have been green and clean, and that's what their actually title is. So Pila Case is one of them, which Xiye has worked with, and they're all compostable and sustainable. Another thing is high quality and timeless design. I always talk about that as an important piece, because if you're buying something that you just really want, for example, a jacket, try to buy something that you know you're going to wear over and over again. Something that you know is not going to sit in your closet or end up in the donation box or in the trash, because it's just going to go to waste. So choose pieces that you're going to wear more than you would expect, because that's the best way to get the usage out of it, because it's like wear versus the price. So those are like the best comparison between the two. But sorry. So the rest of the thing is anything that you use a lot, repair and redesign and upcycle, as well as lease it or swap. There are different companies that kind of go in between the two. So in New York City, we have what goes around comes around, or the real. You're able to swap in items or buy things for a monthly price, and that's the best way to really kind of buy into the sustainable market and be aware of what you're doing. So next slide. So a project that we have done in the past is called the Life Project, and the Life Project is based in the EU and is to raise awareness on environmental problems and environmental policies within the fashion brand. So a lot of the times it's talking about green growth and circular economy, including particular implementations of sustainable business models, sustainable production, products and services. And it is also to develop and promote and implement approaches to how best to implement sustainability into the actual consumer market. So a lot of times it's not that we don't have enough resources to actually become sustainable now. It's just the transition between going to a sustainable economy that actually has companies really trying to focus on that. So the Life Project kind of educates consumers, as well as creates a plan for different larger brands to implement sustainability, and the best way to transfer information and also be transparent to the consumers. So a lot of the times the project is targeting the EU fashion industry in Europe, and it's especially targeting Asia markets as well, fast fashion, and just talking about the key strategic segments, like how to target Gen Z versus the millennials versus baby boomers, how best to implement that idea of sustainability within their own lives. And a lot of the times the industry partners that we're dealing with, it's very hard to just go from fast fashion and having products be made overseas into more of a sustainable market. But Re-Earth is working on trying to connect the two, and working with Life Project, of course, is trying to show that the fashion industry can be transparent. And I think that's the best way to really look at it, is that anything transparent shows and it keeps companies and people accountable. So that's the best way to really fight that issue and sustainability. So that's the end of my segment. So I want to pass it on to Xiye, because she is talking about action and mindset.
Yeah, thank you so much, both Tessie and Joseph, for that. If you can click on, this is like a interactive presentation, so yay. Just 2 more times. And yeah, so I'm basically going to talk about the importance of action and mindset. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I have done in the past, what we're doing right now, and what we should do in the future, and the importance of having a positive mindset through it all. Because as Tessie said before, the climate crisis is already happening, and it can be really daunting. It can be very, scary to think about a future that is actually going to be underwater, and we're not ready for that, or things like that. But if we have a positive and optimistic mindset going into this type of work, we can get so much more done, and we can actually do it in a regenerative way that doesn't hurt us as individuals and as communities. So if you go to the next slide, I'm going to talk about my past. So if you press 1 time, yeah. So for example, I started striking. This is like the first type of climate activism that I did. I thought that, we have been already doing things the right way for too long, writing petitions, advocating for climate legislation, doing a lot of work with different industries. How do I support, like Joseph said, sustainable fashion? How do I support stainless steel rather than plastic? How do I make sure that my community knows that plastic is not something that we should be buying into? And I didn't see any of those things happen, which is why I started organizing strikes in New York City. And this is the picture of the September 20th climate strike, where we got 300,000 people to strike with us. So part of the past is, realizing that there's people behind you, that there's people who want to support and people who want to change to be seen. If you press one more time, this is something else that I have done. I have rallied for New York City to declare a climate emergency. Now, I think that LA probably already has a climate emergency declared, but maybe your smaller city doesn't, your county doesn't, your state doesn't. So something that is very important is to make sure that your government knows that you care about the climate crisis, but also the language that we use. If we keep calling it climate change, people will not get the urgency out of it. If you call it climate emergency, climate crisis, climate instability, then people will start psychologically understanding that this is actually a very detrimental problem that we have to deal with. Next. And then, for example, this is a coverage of the same day of September 20th that Yale did on the climate strike. So when you get higher education to actually be part of the solution, that's another way to be part of the activism world. Because a lot of us, there's a lot of activists who are really into activism, so they have to drop out of school to pursue what they want to do. But then there's other activists who want to take the educational side of it once they want to get a degree and things like that. So getting higher education systems as part of the solution is very important, because they're the ones with the highest, one of the highest investments in the fossil fuel industry. So that's why we have to get our universities, our schools, our institutions to divest. Next slide. Next image. And then this is actually a piece that the HuffPost did on me, highlighting the importance of bringing up Indigenous and marginalized voices into the conversation. Because as Tessie said before, the communities that are the most vulnerable to the climate crisis are frontline communities that are mostly Black and Brown and Indigenous communities. So I come from an Indigenous community in Mexico. I'm actually in Mexico right now. And I can tell you, my hometown flooded and we were not ready for it. If New York City flooded, it would be gone the next day. So that's why we have to make sure that communities are equipped and are ready to deal with the climate impacts of the climate crisis. Next slide. Okay, so now we're going to talk about what's happening right now, the present. So as I mentioned before, Re-Earth Initiative is working to implement the Escazu Agreement in different parts of Latin America and the Caribbean. The Escazu Agreement does a lot of things, but I listed some of the things that it ensures. First, it ensures the right to a healthy environment. It ensures the right to access to information about the environment. It makes sure that communities are consulted when mega projects are coming into communities and wanting to be built, like pipelines, like massive malls or highways. It makes sure that communities are listened to so that the biodiversity is not affected. It also seeks to allow people to be able to apply for reparations in courts. So, for example, in my community, there's a lot of highways that were constructed without the permission of the community. So then my grandfather is able to go to the court and say, I need money because you harmed my land and I need to regenerate it, basically. And the last thing is that it makes sure that environmental defenders are protected. So if you didn't know, Latin America is one of the most dangerous places to be an environmental activist. So this agreement makes sure that these people are protected, that their rights are protected, that we have the right to exercise, just taking care of our territories. So that is what the Escazu Agreement aims to do. We only need 11 countries to ratify it for it to work, and we have 9. So we really want to push the extra 2 countries so that the agreement goes into effect. One of those countries that can ratify it is Mexico. So we're really pushing Mexico to ratify the agreement, for example. Next slide. And this is the future. So we mentioned the movie 2040 before, and I did a project with them to show you what the world can look like in 2040 in a very condensed way. So this is why it's important to have a positive mindset, because all of the things that you're going to see in this video are possible. So we can play the video, you'll see what I'm talking about.
Anything we ever achieved started with someone imagining it first. So if we can't imagine a way out of the climate crisis, it just can't happen. We know that the crisis is getting worse every single day, and many of us are losing hope for our future. But despair is not an option. We must rise up and meet the greatest challenge of our lives with stubborn optimism. And imagining is the first step. So, are you ready to imagine? In this critical decade, the biggest tree planting campaign in history is sucking billions of tons of carbon out of the air, and forests and indigenous lands, they're protected. This is what your city looks like. It's green, I mean everywhere. Streets are pedestrian and kid-friendly. Food growing on rooftops, in car parks, which by the way, we don't need anymore, because we don't own cars anymore. And here's something. Birds. Can you imagine your city as a sanctuary for nature and wildlife? There are solar panels on every rooftop across the globe. Clean, interconnected energy lights every home, every clinic, every school. We no longer choke on the toxic fumes of fossil fuels. It's not hard to imagine. This technology already exists. And what about the millions of new jobs created? Are you picturing it? Really picturing it? Roads? They're green too. Traffic's cut right down. Public transport everywhere is electric, dependable, and free. Can you smell the air? Clean. Farming? All regenerative, which means healthy soil and better food. And we don't eat much meat. Can you imagine what we could do with the third of the world's cropland currently used to grow animal feed? Here's something to imagine. Fields of seaweed, miles long, grown in oceans that cross the planet. They draw down billions of tons of carbon, restore sea life, and guess what? They're a limitless source of protein-rich food. And we can do so much more. Rewild our land, protect our cities from rising sea levels, restore coral reefs. These things we're imagining, they're all possible now, just with technology that's available today. We are the last generation that can prevent catastrophic runaway climate change. We cannot give up. Anything we ever achieved started with someone imagining it first. This is the decade to make this imagined future happen. Share this video and help those around you have the courage to imagine it too.
Thank you so much, all three of you, Xiye, Tessie, and Joseph. I have a couple of questions, and feel free to jump in and take turns, debate, argue, talk, agree, whatever that looks like. First question is, what do you say to our youngest audience who hears your excitement and your calls to action and shares your optimism, but wonders when the solutions seem so obvious and so right there, how have we let it get this bad?
I can go, and then Tessie can add. I see she was going to say something as well. I think that the reason why we let it get to this point is because we never really had a deadline like we have right now. So when the Paris Agreement came out in COP21, it tells us we have 10 years to have our carbon emissions to get below 1.5 degrees of warming. Sorry, that was the IPCC report that came out recently. And now that we say we have 10 years to prevent the worst effects of the climate crisis, now that we have all the scientific evidence behind us, we have seen that it is actually up to us to make that happen. And I don't think generations before us thought about the large global implications of the climate crisis. They only were taught to recycle, maybe. and that's it. So now we are gaining a more comprehensive, intergenerational, intersectional view of climate justice.
So yeah, so like Xiye said to the question of why didn't we do anything now, I'm just gonna add a bit on like how you guys can do something. I think Xiye's video was quite powerful in the sense that you can imagine a future and it is possible. And that, your age should never be what's stopping you, because I think like I'm 16 right now, Joseph and Xiye are just 18, and your age should never stop you. And that, people do have the power, whether that's starting from writing a petition or even talking to your family and making those changes. It does make the impact, and that we need to be ready to imagine the future that is possible. So that would be what I want to tell all the children that's watching us today.
Yeah, I also would say, like, take us as an example. I think all of us really never understood the full effect of everything, and once you kind of dive into it, it's a lot to take in. Like, especially like when I first started this, it was a lot of information and it was very surprising, the state that we're in, and it becomes overwhelming at times. But if you implement stuff at home and you start making a change with your family, you start making a change, it starts to spread. So for all of us, we never thought Re-Earth would be where it is right now. It started off with 14 people on a Zoom call because of COVID-19, and somehow it's turned into a very big NGO that we're actually is seeing create some change. So that's just like a little example of like where a possibility or a dream turns into an actual like reality, and that I always like to point that out as well.
Yeah, I think all good things have started on a Zoom call during the pandemic. Thank you, guys. Talk for a moment about the industries. I'll throw it out there that I think fashion is probably going to be one you'll mention. The industries and the interests that you think benefit from kind of maintaining the status quo. The status quo, of course, not being static at all, but rather a consistent and reliable decline of our planet. But which industries and interests do you think are benefiting from us doing
nothing? So for example, the plastic industry, when plastic first came, because everything used to be glass before, like my parents remember getting milk in glass, and getting milk wasn't a problem like it is today. Right now we're like, oh my gosh, the agriculture industry is really damaging the world. But when we discovered plastic, when we discovered it was impermeable, when we discovered it was really easy to throw away, when we kind of invented throwaway culture, that's when things started to get bad. And I always like to tell the story of one of the mentors I had. The time where she realized that we were in a crisis was when she was on a boat with her family, and somebody gave her a bag of trash, and they told her, throw it out, and she said, where? And they were just like, in the ocean. And that's when she realized that you never really throw things out. You just move them out of your vision. You move them out of your way to not see the pollution and the contamination. But the environment feels it. The ocean feels it. Our rainforests feel it. So that's why it's so important to catch those times in which you realize what is going on, and also call out these industries. The plastic industry has been around at this level for about 20 or 30 years. That is nothing compared to how long we have been here and how long we have known about the climate crisis. So I encourage you, from a plastic perspective, to really be mindful about where we find plastic and what the solutions to them are. And like Joseph said, we have worked with Pila. Wait, here it is. And these are completely made from recycled plastic. And if you put them in the earth, they will decompose. And so these are solutions that are already in place and that we can already start to implement.
So the next thing that I would go off of plastic, especially the food industry. So when you walk into a supermarket, even things that kind of look like cardboard, they have plastic lining in the middle. So cereal boxes, for example, even the plastic bag with inside of it, they try to make it say that you're able to recycle this, but the fact is you really have to like peel off the plastic and then it becomes recyclable. And then also the one thing that really annoys me is when I see people buying fruit out of like a plastic container, even though there's like blueberries, for example, and like different produce such as that, it's all in plastic containers where they could put in compostable ones at least. And a lot of times I just really don't get all of the plastic that I see in supermarkets. And then of course I'm going to talk about fashion because I feel like that's a huge one. Like fashion, bedding, anything that you really buy, there's always microfibers, even when they say like polyester is now a huge component of the fashion industry. It's cheaper to make, it's less expensive than cotton or silk to use. So polyester is one of the most harmful products that people actually use in the fashion industry. It ends up in water whenever you wash it, and especially for bedding. Like I always have to make sure that bedding and towels are always made out of pure cotton or pure organic materials, because a lot of times it's always polyester, like 40%, or they try to sneak it in. So that's like my the ones that I focus on.
Yeah, and just to add on quite quickly to what she said, like finding those alternatives, that's another idea of an action you guys can do. Email your local restaurants or local cafes and ask them to do that extra effort of going not plastic. One of our co-founders, Kate from Singapore, she held this campaign called Bring Your Own, where, cafes would give a discount for individuals bringing their own bottles and their own cups to cafe shops. So that's just an example of how we can target this plastic industry that is benefiting off of this climate crisis and making that change.
Awesome. I wanted to follow up with talking about some of the laws regulating these industries, specifically, Joseph, laws regulating the fashion industry. Is it that we need more laws, or is it a matter of laws being enforced? Obviously, it's more complicated than that, but talk to us, and this can apply across the industries that all of you discussed, but talk to us about the sorts of laws that need to change.
So in the fashion industry, laws, I think you really have to focus on international laws, because a lot of times fashion industries in the US kind of get away with the policies that were put in place, especially in New York and in California and a lot of the states that implemented actual change. Because there's a whole economical argument behind shipping internationally and from China, where there are no policies put into place about what they could do. Or a lot of times when you look at a tag, it's from China, Bangladesh, or these countries that don't have any consequence or transparency within the fashion industry. And a lot of times, even if you do put a change in place, it doesn't really change, because a lot of times there's no one looking over it. So there was a project that was put into place where they went to Chinese factories and they were trying to overlook sustainability within those factories, but they only get checked twice a year. So of course they are ready for one of these inspectors come, because they give them the dates and they just look like they're not dumping, and they're making sure that they're able to recycle gray water and do all of these things. So to target those issues of where really the fashion industry is failing is internationally. I think you really have to focus on those countries that we know that most of the produce are coming from. Most of the stuff that we wear are coming from these countries. So it either has to start from those countries actually being aware and starting to become transparent, or has to come from the actual companies that we buy from. So Forever 21, H&M, they're starting to get a little bit better, but they're still overall putting out products that don't meet the expectation of being sustainable at all. And of course, the higher end industries, such as a lot of the stores that you can name, are being held at Saks Fifth Avenue and Gucci, they're starting to become more sustainable, but not everyone has $800 to spend on a t-shirt. So you really have to be aware of the consumer index versus how much that relationship between the two. So.
Wow. Yeah. Tessie or Xiye?
Yeah, I was gonna quickly add that international law is super important, but when we think about the body that implements international law, is usually the United Nations. And a lot of times the United Nations cannot hold countries accountable. So I think that these international laws and treaties and agreements are important as for international support of a certain thing. But when it comes to actual change on the ground, it is up to us as people to vote with our money. Activism is about where you buy, what you consume, what you eat, what you talk about. So it's up to us as people on the ground to actually come up and say, I don't want you to do this. I don't want my local cafe to give plastic bags out. In New York City, we got plastic bags banned, or I think taxed, not even banned yet, but we have a tax on plastic bags. And a lot of people don't care to pay 5 more cents. So that's why we have to make sure that these are comprehensive laws that come not only from the top down, but from the bottom up. Because when our behavior changes, then our cities change, and then our countries change.
Yeah, and just to add on quite quickly, I think that part of adaptation is quite important, because we cannot continue in the old structure of, I feel like Joseph had mentioned, we kind of dump the production and the manufacturing, the more dirty part of that business, to the countries down in the global south. Therefore, when you look at it, like Joseph had said, the international law and actually keeping those companies accountable is quite important, and that we need to adapt through like education and educating the people in those countries that what is happening is exploitation and it cannot happen that way. And we need to add those resources and adapt.
Great, thank you. Xiye mentioned the story of plastic going into kind of going overboard, and you said you never really throw anything out, you just move it out of your vision. I couldn't help but sort of hear the connection to kind of the intersection between this climate emergency and social justice and racial injustice, because I think we've gotten really good at moving things out of our vision, right? Can you guys talk about the intersection between social justice, the climate emergency, the global pandemic, and why it's so important to have representation in the youth climate movement?
I'll go because my computer might die. My mom is getting my charger, but if it doesn't happen, then I'll have to sign off for a second. But when it comes to the climate crisis and racial justice, there's this thing called environmental racism, and that I didn't know about. But when I first moved into New York City, it was very apparent to me, because New York City is the most segregated city in the country, in the United States. So when you think about blocks, like we can literally think of blocks that divide not only like higher income people and lower income people, but also race goes into that. In the Bronx, for example, 17% of adults have asthma, which is 10% higher than the national average, just because they have two highways right there that contaminate the Bronx. And that is targeted. That is not coincidental. That is because these communities are not known to have the ability to speak up at City Hall or with politicians. Like the representative in Congress of Bronx and Queens in previous years was a white man who didn't even live in the Bronx. He just wanted a legislative position. So there's not even people from the same community representing them. And then, for example, when in a global scale, when it comes to plastic, all the plastic that we throw away, the 250 million tons of plastic that the US throws away ends up in Southeast Asian countries in illegal recycling ranks sometimes. That recycling doesn't really work at the end of the day, because you recycle something and then it goes back into the market, but then the period of recycling kind of ends and then it just becomes landfill. And all this landfill actually contaminates communities, in poor communities in Southeast Asian countries that are not prepared to deal with the health ramifications of these things. So that's how the environment, the climate crisis is so tied with environmental racism and climate justice when it comes to the solutions.
So just to add on about the New York aspect is I could use hurricanes, for example, because I'm living through one right now. So New York City is being hit by a hurricane right now. So during Hurricane Sandy, a lot of the infrastructure that was put into place and urban planning, for example, were given to high income neighborhoods. And a lot of those lower income neighborhoods were totally ignored. So I live in Queens, which is an outer borough. However, maybe like a mile down the waterfront, there is a set of housing projects that was set by the city across the street. And the urban planning that was set into place by New York City, they gave us water barriers for each apartment. They made sure that everything was set into place to make sure that overall the waterfront was kept into, actually, it wasn't going to be affected at all. My dad and I took a drive down afterwards. They put nothing in front of the housing projects. And is a lower income neighborhood that was totally ignored during this huge global warming risk. And I immediately researched different issues in New York City. The Bronx, for example, no infrastructure was put into place as well. However, when you went onto the west side where Columbia University was, the Hudson River and the East River, that was put into place with the infrastructure. So it becomes a policy-oriented issue where they totally ignore the actual effect of climate justice, and then they don't realize that in doing that, they're also causing an issue with racial justice and how income and race really comes into play about how they're protecting people from hurricanes, from flooding, because they're just being ignored and pushed aside. So that's another example of why New York City is so segregated. You could literally cross one street and you end up in a neighborhood that's a GDP like way lower, and then the city doesn't focus on them. So
yeah. Thank you guys so much. Just for the sake of time, this could go on for so much longer and I'd be so excited, but we are going to conclude. I am left with so many things, but as an educator, one of my takeaways was that Tessie said education is mitigation and adaptation. And for me, that's so powerful to feel like working in an industry that has so much potential to make a difference. You can follow Re-Earth Initiative on Instagram. It's re.earth.org. Is that right, guys? And then on Facebook, Re-Earth, that's Re-Earth Initiative. On YouTube, Re-Earth Initiative. On Twitter, it's Re_Earth.org. And their website is reearthin, that's in.org. You can also follow these individuals on Instagram. We have Joseph Wilk, that's W-I-L-K with an underscore. We have Tessie is hungry, which I could not relate to more. And then we have Xiye Bera, it's Xiyebera. Sound good, guys? Did I get all that right?
Thank you guys.
Okay.
Thank you guys for having us.
Thank you so much. We're so inspired. We really can't thank you enough for your time and your energy. And we just can't wait to work with you again. Thank you to our audience for joining us. Please join us all this week and next week at 10 a.m. as our series continues. Speaking of plastic, tomorrow we'll be talking with Allison Young, Program Director from Five Gyres, who is leading the way on removing plastic from our oceans. Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye, guys.